Yesterday I came back from a really great EAA conference held in Maastricht, which is a really big international archaeology conference. And I was allowed for the very first time to present there in a scientific environment on the Moluccan Heritage Project. And I thought it was a good idea to actually repeat the same presentation as I did last week here in my house on video, so I can share the same thing with as many people as possible. I'm going to do exactly the same presentation as I did last week on the conference, and well, I'll just start right away. So what is this presentation about? Well, this presentation is called the Moluccan Conflict Heritage in the Netherlands Archaeology Presentation. It's a presentation of the Moluccan Heritage Project, which I'm running right now, in Dutch called the project Moluks Erfgoed. So what is this project about? Well, there's actually several ways you can look at it. If I would put it in most regular scientific phrasing, I would say it's an archaeology of modern conflict. A modern conflict between the Dutch Moluccans in the Netherlands on the one side, and on the other hand the Dutch state. And this conflict peaked mainly between 1970 and 1978. However, this phrasing is a bit problematic in the sense that one could also think from this phrasing that it's quite a conventional project, but in the Dutch archaeological context it is definitely not. So another phrasing of this project would be that it's a Dutch experiment in engaged archaeological intervention in a post-colonial conflict or a colonial conflict still partially unresolved. So what does this mean? Well, first of all, it's an experiment. It's an experiment because I'm using archaeological thinking and archaeological technique, or archaeological practice, better phrase, to create a positive change into society. And I've never done that before myself in this way, so it's definitely an experiment for myself. But I think it's also not done in the Netherlands this way very often before, probably never before. So in this case, it's also an experiment for my country. It is not an experiment in the international context, because I think these kinds of things, or this way of thinking, has been done in other countries already before. It's just in our country, I think it's relatively new still. If you don't agree, please let me know. It's also an engaged archaeological intervention because I'm not aiming so much to create archaeological knowledge or historic knowledge as archaeology would normally do, but I'm actually trying to change something in society. I will explain this more a little bit further. Also, I call this a conflict still partially unresolved. That's the third phrase you see here. And this means that because of the conflict not being completely resolved, the content of the project is also inherently political. It's impossible to escape politics in doing this project. So what's the main inspiration for this project? The theoretical framework, as we call it. Well, main inspiration comes from the growing and more abundantly present work of the archaeology on the contemporary past. You see in the right corner, you see the big book by Paul Grace Brown and Rodney Harrison and Angela Pesini. But there's others. There's Buckley and Lucas. There's the work of Cornelius Holtorf and many others. This is actually the main framework, the main inspiration that I use for this work. Other inspiration comes from the archaeology of modern conflict. I put here the book Ethics by Gabriel Moschenska and Alfredo González-Ruibal. Especially the latter's work is a great inspiration for this work so far. A third inspiration is ideas on archaeological activism. A little bit to a lesser extent, I put here the book by Sonia Attalay and others. It's a little bit less of an inspiration because I have not completely read the book yet, but actually the general idea of using archaeology as activism is important in this work. So this also means that there are things that I'm less inspired by, and one of the things I'm less inspired by is historical archaeology, because, well, in a general sense, historical archaeology tries to add to the historical narrative, and that's not in essence what I'm trying to do here. Also very important to know is that the work as such is not academically based at this moment. I'm trying to change that. I'm thinking about changing that, but at this time it's just a small scale project which is slowly growing. So what's the narrative here? In the 1970s, the Dutch community suddenly was surprised, one might say, by an upcoming or an explosion of violence among Moluccan young people. Several things happened in this period. In 1970, the house of the ambassador of Indonesia was hijacked by a couple of young people, Moluccan people. One person died. In 1975 there was a hijacking of a train near the village of Wijster in the province of Drenthe. I think 2 people died there, 2 civilians died there, they were killed by the Moluccan hijackers. In 1977 we have a really big, well, it was a big hijacking, I would say, because it was the end was very violent. I will say a bit more about that in a moment. Quite some people died, 6 people of the hijackers and 2 people of the civilian citizens that were inside the train. And there was also, to conclude the list, there was a very violent hijacking of the provincial office in Asse in 1978. And all these events, they have several things in common. They all resulted in civilian casualties on both sides, also inflicted by both sides, not in all cases, but both the Dutch state and the Moluccans caused casualties. On the other side, there's also in all cases a very strong military presence, and that's why you can actually see this conflict, this explosion of violence, as also a military conflict, as a military conflict which was fought out using military equipment. The most well-known hijacking was that of the Punt in 1977. Again, a train was hijacked by a group of Moluccans, I think 8, just from heart. It ended really violently because in the end a massive machine gun barrage was used to end the hijacking. Marines stormed the train, killed 6 hijackers and 2 citizens. At the same time with the hijacking of the train, there was also a hijacking of a school in this village of Boven-Smeelde. A lot of children were captured, were taken hostage and were forced to shout, Mr. President, I want to live, or in Dutch, Van Acht, wij willen leven. And the images of this setting where these children were shouting has gone all over the world. And if people in an international context know the Moluccan conflict, the Moluccan-Dutch state conflict, they mainly remember this scene where these children are shouting out of the windows. So this is really the most well-known and most violently ending hijacking. So what's the origin of this problem? Well, the origins lie in the Indonesian archipel, which you see here in this image. Well, in 1949, the Indonesian state got independent with the first Prime Minister Sukarno. Well, what you see is here is well, generally speaking, the entire Indonesian archipel, and in the red circle you see the Moluccan Islands. And it's not possible to explain the complexity of the situation in this video, but to be really short in it, I can just say that the Moluccan state also declared their own independence, the South Moluccan state, in 1950. And this caused a very difficult situation for the Dutch state. I know I'm going really fast. I'm passing all the details which make this thing a really complex problem. I know that, but I'm trying to be short here. I'm trying to be brief. So what happened? Because there was now an independent Indonesian unity state, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, independent Moluccan state, there was a problem with the former Dutch colonial army called KNIL in the Netherlands. In this army, there was still a large amount of Moluccan soldiers, military personnel still present. But of course the Dutch colonial army was disbanded when Indonesia got independent. So these Moluccan people could go back to their own houses, to their own countries, to their own islands. The problem was, however, that because of this conflict, they were not allowed to go back to the Moluccans by the Indonesian government, but they were also not allowed to go to Indonesia because law prevented that they would now be surrendered to their new enemy. So these people had nowhere to go, and as a result they were brought to the Netherlands in Europe for a temporary stay. So here on the left you can see a picture of how they were, how they arrived in the Netherlands in winter. They were, of course, the Moluccans are tropical islands, so they were really cold for them. And then they were housed in former Nazi concentration camp barracks. Now this may sound like a very crude thing from our current perspective to put them in Nazi concentration camps, but at that time the Dutch country was still recovering very much from the Second World War. There was scarcity in housing, so where do you put a group of 13,000 people, soldiers and families, when they arrive in the country? Well, you put them in the place that's available. In this case, it were the wooden barracks from the former concentration camps. There were 3 or at least 2 big mistakes made in this process. The first mistake was that when these Moluccans arrived in the Netherlands, they were immediately deprived of their military rank. So from first being a soldier or maybe even an officer in the Dutch colonial army, they arrived in the Netherlands and then they were nothing. They had no rank, so they were sort of deprived of their self-respect. Another problem is that they were promised to go back within a couple of months. Some say 6 months, some say a little longer. This never happened. This promise was broken, and this caused big grief in the Moluccan community, which expected to go back on short notice, which never happened. They are still here to this day. The third mistake that occurred after this is that even though there's always been people in the Dutch government who were actively trying to solve the Moluccan issue, as it was called, they never really succeeded in addressing the problem. It was sort of a stuck thing, and in this process they forgot to really look at what the Moluccan people actually needed. And I think probably a big part of it was recognition for their problems, which they didn't get. So then, to everybody's surprise, suddenly there is violence in the 70s. But then you can say, yeah, what was it really? Was this a protest out of hand? Was this a guerrilla of freedom fighters because the hijackers in all cases tried to get attention for their Moluccan cause, but also for the problems there were in the camps and the fact that previous hijackers had been just taken prison and, well, the real problem never got attention? Or is it just the archaeology here of terrorism and crime? Of course, the Dutch state would treat the problem as such, as terrorism and crime, in the 1970s itself. And I think that still quite some people in the Netherlands see it as such. However, at the base of this whole thing, whether you see it as protest or guerrilla or terrorism, there is a strong social injustice, which was inflicted by the Dutch state to the Moluccan people. So now it's 2017. I started this project in 1915, and I think we can generally say that right now there is a change in the perception of the problem. There is more and more attention for the injustice which was caused to the Moluccan people in the 1950s and afterwards. Actually, in some musea you will now find very precise description of that. Indeed, there was caused social injustice to these people. So there is more and more a situation of growing justice. So I was thinking, if there is more and more attention for social justice, there should also be more attention for archaeological justice. I come from a background in where I did mainly research on the Second World War, and I just started reasoning that I put it in a phrase here, that if archaeology is the science and craft that studies material remains of vitally meaningful historical events, like for example the Second World War, if this is the case, then there should also symmetrically be an archaeological attention for the sites of the Moluccan-Dutch conflict of 1951 to 1980 as a method of making present and translating the past. Very simple reasoning. If we use archaeology to study important events in Dutch history, then this is an important history too, and we should study it archaeologically. So what do I do in the project so far? Well, actually, I started really in the way that archaeologists would start in any project, especially in modern conflict like the Second World War. I just started with a site inventarisation. So what I do is I would use historical and GIS sources to get a feel of what sites there are, where they are located, and how big they are, and what they consist of. For example, here you see the site of the 1966 fire at the Indonesian embassy, which was a prequel to the later events which happened against the Dutch government. The other thing I'm looking at more and more, I only recently started doing this, is I'm looking at the Moluccan camps. We call them woonorden in Dutch, and these are the places, very often former Nazi concentration camps where the Moluccans lived. There's about 90 of them. In the memory of the Dutch right now they are actually very often just point locations. That means that they are like here on this picture from an archive. They're really like points on a map. They have no physical dimension. So I am interested in where are they and what do they look like and what's their actual size. And sometimes these camps are remembered from a Moluccan perspective. More often that it's the case that if they are remembered, they're remembered from the atrocities in the World War II, so the Nazi time, and not so much for the Moluccan period. Then I go and visit these places. This is a picture. The upper picture is from the Indonesian ambassador's residence area. The house you see is not the residence itself, it's actually the Iranian residence. And I make these then and now pictures to get a general feel of the sites. So here you see a Dutch vehicle, military vehicle, and then I try to make a picture in exactly the same way. Of course, the question here then comes up, are there material traces of these conflict events? Because as an archaeologist, you do need material traces to do your research on, otherwise it gets really theoretical in an archaeological sense. So what I'm looking at is if these sites do contain traces. And though you have to look really hard, yes, there are traces, you can find them. Material traces of this conflict do exist, though they are pretty few in number. What you see on the picture here is actually a trench. You can not really see it very well, but there is a trench there, and it was dug by the Marines or the police observation units that observed the train which was hijacked at the Punt. There's one picture on the left too, which is a very important picture in the project right now, because this is a railway pole. I call it a pole which holds the electricity lines which are above the trains, which provide the power to the trains. And you can see that there's still bullet holes in this pole, which are from the machine gun barrage on the train in 1977. So another part of the project is the project website, www.molukserfgoed.com. It has become more and more important for the project. Why? In the beginning I called this project a archaeological intervention. Well, you cannot do an intervention if you're just doing research on your own and keep the results to yourself. This is a big problem in archaeological research in many cases. So I wanted to have a way to directly communicate with the public, and well, to draw out response, to see if people like it or perhaps hate it, which is also possible, and to share the results. Also, I wanted to use the project website to team up with others, so through the website I can easily tell others about the project, and then well, I can easily explain what it is that I'm doing. So this is actually already the most of my presentation. Are there results? Yes, there are results of the project. I've discussed a few of them in this presentation, not all of them. Some things I really want to work on further before I can really share them. My main focus right now is an expansion of the project, both in completing data sets, but also in gaining more support for the project, which I think is really necessary to make it worthwhile. I put the text of the word PhD here. Yes, I'm trying to work on the possibility to get this project in a PhD project, which would really I think be helpful, because it would perhaps give me some more time to really do it on a more profound way. But that's sort of the main attention right now. But as far as results go, as an archaeological intervention, the project did have a nice result. Together with some people which I found by just speaking to them or contacting them, or through the project website, we sent a letter to the Minister of the Netherlands to ask if it wouldn't be possible to schedule these objects which I found at the Punt as possible heritage. And only last week I got a notice from our Minister of Culture, Jet Bussemaker, Miss Jet Bussemaker, that indeed she agrees with the point that they should at least be researched if this is valid national heritage. So I think this is really the great first result of the project. As far as intervention goes, we seem to have achieved at least something, and well, we'll now just have to go and see what will come from it. So that's all I want to say for now. Thank you for your attention, and you can follow the project if you like on our project website, which is www.molukserfgoed.com. There's no English for it, but I will put it here in the screen so you can find it if you like. Thank you very much.